The tall glass towers of Zentari University reached up into the purple sky. This was the most famous school in the whole galaxy. For 300 years, the smartest beings from every planet came here to learn. But there was one group that had never been here before. Humans. J. Collins walked through the main entrance of the university. He was 22 years old and came from a place called Ohio on Earth. He had brown hair and blue eyes, and he looked very ordinary compared to the other students around him. Some had 4 arms, others had green skin, and a few could read minds. Jake was just a regular human. Professor Vextar stood in his office, looking out at the courtyard below. He had silver scales covering his body, and 4 arms that moved like a spider's legs. He had been teaching at this university for 60 years. His job was to study how different species think and learn. He was an expert on something called the quantum logic paradigm. This was so hard that only 12 beings in the entire galaxy understood it. The professor had heard that a human was coming to his class. He was curious, but not impressed. Humans had only learned to travel between stars a short time ago. Their brains were small, and they had no special powers. How could they compete with species that had been exploring space for thousands of years? Jake's first day was in the advanced physics building. The classroom was huge and filled with strange-looking students. There were tall blue beings with long necks, short furry creatures with 6 eyes, and floating gas clouds that could somehow talk. Jake took a seat in the middle of the room and opened his notebook. Professor Vextar entered the room with his 4 arms swinging. His silver scales caught the light from the ceiling. He looked at Jake for a moment, then began his lesson. Today, we will study quantum mechanics, he said in a voice that sounded like metal scraping against metal. He wrote a problem on the board. It was full of numbers and symbols that hurt to look at. This problem has been unsolved for 20 years. The professor announced, "Only the smartest 4th-year students can even understand what it means." The other students stared at the board with confusion. Some of them started working on smaller parts of the problem. Others just gave up and put their heads down. Jake looked at the problem for about 30 seconds. Then he raised his hand. "Yes, human?" Professor Vextar asked, sounding annoyed. "I think the answer is 42.7, Jake said simply. Room went quiet. Professor Vextar's 4 eyes opened wide. He checked his computer and found that Jake was correct. The other students whispered to each other in their different languages. "Lucky guess," the professor said, but his voice sounded less sure than before. After class, Jake met with other human students. There were only 12 humans at the whole university. Lisa Morgan was studying alien biology. She had red hair and green eyes. Alex Turner was learning about engineering. He was tall and had dark skin. Both of them had heard what happened in Jake's class. "How did you solve that problem so fast?" Lisa asked. Jake shrugged. "It just made sense to me. I looked at it and saw the pattern." "What pattern?" Alex wanted to know. "I don't know how to explain it," Jake said. "It's like when you look at clouds and see shapes." The answer was just there. Word about Jake spread quickly through the university. Students and teachers talked about the human who solved an impossible problem. But Professor Vextar was not convinced. He thought it was just luck. Humans were still primitive compared to the great races of the galaxy. The professor decided to test Jake properly. There was something called the impossibility theorem. It was the hardest puzzle in the known universe. No one had solved it in 200 years. If the human could solve this, then maybe there was something special about his species. Professor Vextar worked late into the night preparing his test. He wanted to show everyone that humans were not as smart as they seemed. The impossibility theorem combined math, physics, and logic in ways that broke normal thinking. It required understanding multiple dimensions and time travel and consciousness. The next morning, Jake went to breakfast in the university cafeteria. The food was strange. Some of it glowed, and some of it moved on the plate. He ate carefully while other students stared at him. He could hear them whispering about yesterday's class. "The human got lucky," said a blue student with tentacles for arms. "Humans are not that smart," agreed a floating crystal being. Jake ignored them and finished his breakfast. He had always been good at solving puzzles, even as a child. While other kids played video games, Jake liked doing crosswords and brain teasers. His teachers on Earth said he had a special way of thinking, but Jake never thought it was anything unusual. As he walked to his next class, Jake noticed a crowd gathering outside Professor Vextar's office. Students from every species were talking excitedly. Something big was happening. Professor Vextar appeared at his office door. His 4 arms were crossed, and his silver scales seemed to shine brighter than usual. "I have an announcement," he said in his metal voice. "Tomorrow, I will present the impossibility theorem to my advanced class. All students are welcome to attend." The crowd buzzed with excitement. Everyone knew about the impossibility theorem. It was famous throughout the galaxy as the one problem that could not be solved. Jake felt eyes turning toward him. Word had spread about yesterday's problem, and now everyone wanted to see if the human could handle a real challenge. Professor Vextar looked directly at Jake and smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "I am especially interested to see how our human student handles this challenge," the professor said loudly. Jake nodded politely. He had no idea what the impossibility theorem was, but he was curious to find out. As the crowd began to break up, he heard students making bets on how quickly he would fail. Tomorrow would be interesting. News about the impossibility theorem spread through the university like fire. By evening, every student knew that Professor Vextar was going to test the human tomorrow. The normal lecture hall only held 50 students, but over 300 beings wanted to watch. Jake Collins sat in his small dorm room reading a book. It was not a science book or a math book. It was an old detective story from Earth about a man named Sherlock Holmes. His roommate, Flux, was a nervous creature from the Altair system. Flux had purple skin and could change colors when he was worried. Right now, he was flashing between purple and orange. "Jake, you should be studying," Flux said, his voice making a sound like bubbles popping. "The impossibility theorem is the hardest puzzle in the galaxy. You need to prepare." Jake turned a page in his book. "I like to keep my mind fresh. If I study too hard, I might overthink the problem." "Overthink?" Flux's skin turned bright red with shock. "Jake, the greatest minds in the galaxy have worked on this problem for 200 years. The Karathi spent 50 years just trying to understand what it meant. How can you overthink something like that?" Jake smiled and closed his book. Sometimes the harder you try to force an answer, the further away it gets. Like trying to remember a word that's on the tip of your tongue. Flux did not understand, but he had learned not to argue with human logic. Meanwhile, Professor Vextar was in his office preparing for tomorrow's demonstration. He had invited other professors to watch. Dr. Yulmoth from the math department would be there. So would Professor Ziktar from cosmic engineering. Even the university's chancellor, an ancient being called Kol Vex, planned to attend. Professor Vextar pulled up the impossibility theorem on his computer screen. The equations filled the entire wall of his office. They twisted and turned in ways that hurt to look at. The math was so complex that it seemed to move on its own, shifting between dimensions that normal minds could not grasp. He had spent 40 years studying this theorem. He understood every part of it, but he could not solve it. No one could. It asked questions about the nature of reality itself. It wanted to know if consciousness could exist in multiple states at the same time while staying connected across different dimensions. The professor's forearms moved quickly as he prepared his presentation. He wanted to make sure everyone understood just how impossible this problem was. He wanted them to see the human fail in the most obvious way possible. In the main cafeteria, students were gathering in groups to talk about tomorrow's event. The betting had started immediately. Most aliens were wagering on how long Jake would last before giving up. 10 minutes, said a Korathi student with a brain the size of a watermelon. Humans think in straight lines. This problem requires circular thinking. 5 minutes, disagreed a Vortanian who could read surface thoughts. I can sense his confusion already, and he has not even seen the theorem yet. 30 seconds, laughed a machine intelligence from the synthetic worlds. My processors would need a full day just to understand the question. The other human students sat at their own table. Lisa Morgan stirred her soup nervously. It was bright green and smelled like flowers. Alex Turner was trying to eat something. That looked like moving spaghetti. Both of them were worried about Jake. He seemed so calm about this, Lisa said. Does he understand what he's walking into? Jake has always been different, Alex replied. Back on Earth, he could solve puzzles that stumped professors. But this is the impossibility theorem. It's not just hard. It's supposed to be unsolvable. Maybe that's why he can do it, said Betty Walsh, another human student. She was studying alien languages and could speak 12 different tongues. We think differently than everyone else here. Maybe our way of thinking is what's needed. Or maybe he's going to embarrass our entire species, Alex said quietly. Across the galaxy, word was spreading about tomorrow's event. The Galactic News Network had picked up the story. Universities on a dozen worlds were planning to broadcast the lecture live. Scientists everywhere wanted to see if a human could solve the unsolvable. Professor Vextar's office was full of messages from colleagues. Everyone wanted to know more about this human student. What made him think he could succeed where others had failed? Was there something special about human brains that no one had discovered? The professor answered the messages with growing confidence. He had studied humans. Their brains were small and simple. They had no telepathic abilities, no quantum processing power, no connection to higher dimensions. They were just clever animals who had learned to use tools and build spaceships. As the evening grew late, Jake finished his detective story and got ready for bed. He brushed his teeth and put on his pajamas like it was any other night. Flux watched him with amazement. How can you be so calm? Flux asked, his skin cycling through every color he knew. Worry won't help me solve the problem, Jake said. Whatever happens tomorrow will happen. Getting upset about it now just wastes energy. But what if you fail? What if you make humans look bad? Jake sat on his bed and looked at his alien roommate. Then I fail. It won't be the end of the world. Someone else will solve it someday. Flux's skin turned a confused shade of brown. Human thinking was so strange to him, not in other parts of the university. Professors were having emergency meetings. Some thought it was unfair to put this pressure on a student. Others believed it would be good to humble the humans who had been bragging about their problem-solving abilities. Dr. Yulmoth called Professor Vextar late that night. Are you sure about this? She asked. The theorem has broken stronger minds than his. That is exactly why I'm doing it, Vextar replied. Humans need to understand their place in the galactic community. They are newcomers, not miracle workers. But what if he solves it? Professor Vextar laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Impossible. If the greatest minds in the galaxy cannot solve it, how could a primitive human succeed? The night passed slowly. Students from every species stayed up late, discussing what would happen. Some felt sorry for Jake. Others were excited to see him fail. A few wondered if maybe, just maybe, he might surprise everyone. Jake Collins slept peacefully. He dreamed about detective stories and puzzle boxes and patterns that danced in the air like music. In his dreams, complex problems had simple solutions, and the answers were always hiding in plain sight. Tomorrow would prove whether human intuition could triumph over alien logic, or whether some problems truly were impossible to solve. The morning would bring the greatest test in the university's history. The morning sun cast long shadows across the university campus. Students began gathering outside the main lecture hall, hours before the demonstration was scheduled to begin. The normal hall held 50 beings, but today over 300 wanted to watch. University staff had to move the event to the grand auditorium, the largest room on campus. Jay Collins ate his breakfast slowly in the cafeteria. He had toast and orange juice, simple food from Earth that the university kitchen could make. Other students kept staring at him, but he paid no attention. He was thinking about the detective story he had read last night. The detective always said the answer was obvious, once you knew where to look. Professor Vextar arrived at his office early to make final preparations. His forearms moved quickly as he loaded the impossibility theorem into the auditorium's holographic display system. The equations were so complex that they needed special projectors to show all the dimensions at once. Dr. Yilmith knocked on his door. She was a tall, thin being with yellow skin and large black eyes. Vextar, are you certain about this? The human seems very confident. Confidence means nothing, the professor replied, his silver scales gleaming under the office lights. This theorem has defeated every great mind for 2 centuries. Mathematical ability, logical thinking, computational power, nothing has worked. What could one human possibly do that the rest of us cannot? Other professors began arriving for the demonstration. Professor Zektar came from the engineering department. He was a massive being made of living stone who spoke in a voice like grinding rocks. Chancellor Kolvex arrived in a floating chair, his ancient form wrapped in shimmering robes. Even professors from other universities had come to watch. The grand auditorium filled quickly. Students from every species found seats in the curved rows that surrounded the main stage. The walls were covered with screens, so everyone could see the holographic display clearly. Cameras from the Galactic News Network set up in the back to broadcast the event across known space. Jake entered the auditorium with the other human students. Lisa Morgan walked beside him, her red hair bright under the ceiling lights. Alex Turner followed close behind, his face showing worry. They found seats in the front section where Jake could see the stage clearly. "How do you feel?" Lisa whispered. "Curious," Jake replied. "I want to see what this theorem looks like." The betting pools had grown overnight. Students were wagering not just on whether Jake would fail, but on how spectacular his failure would be. The Karathi students had calculated the odds at 10,000 to 1 against the human succeeding. Even other humans were betting against Jake. Professor Vextar walked onto the stage, his forearms carrying data tablets and projection controls. The crowd fell silent as he approached the center podium. His silver scales caught the stage lights, making him look like a metallic statue come to life. "Welcome to this historic demonstration," he began, his voice echoing through the auditorium. "Today we will examine the impossibility theorem, the greatest puzzle in galactic history. For 200 years, this problem has challenged the finest minds of our civilization." The professor activated the holographic display. The air above the stage filled with mathematical equations that seemed to twist and move on their own. The formulas were written in symbols from dozens of different mathematical systems, creating a web of numbers and logic that hurt to look at directly. "The theorem asks a simple question," Professor Vextar continued. "Can consciousness exist in a state of quantum superposition while maintaining temporal coherence across multiple dimensional planes? To answer this question, we must use pure mathematics and logic. No guessing, no intuition, only rigorous proof." Students throughout the auditorium shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the advanced mathematics students could barely understand what the symbols meant. The equations folded in on themselves, creating loops of logic that seemed to have no beginning or end. The Korathi Collective, with their enhanced brains, worked on this problem for 50 years, the professor explained. They used computational networks that could process quadrillions of calculations per second. They failed. More equations appeared in the holographic display, layering on top of the original theorem. The complexity grew until the air seemed filled with moving mathematics. The Vortanian High Council combined their telepathic abilities to approach the problem from angles no single mind could comprehend. They failed. The artificial intelligences of the synthetic worlds, with processing power beyond imagination, declared the theorem unsolvable. They failed. Professor Vextar's 4 eyes found Jake Collins in the crowd. His scaled face formed what passed for a smile among his species, but it was not a kind expression. And now we have a human student who believes he can succeed where the greatest minds in the galaxy have failed. Mr. Collins, please join me on stage. Jake stood up slowly. The auditorium buzzed with whispers as he walked down the steps toward the stage. Some students laughed quietly. Others shook their heads in pity. The cameras focused on his ordinary human face as he climbed the stairs. Mr. Collins, Professor Vextar said once Jake reached the podium, before you stands the impossibility theorem. It incorporates quantum mechanics, temporal physics, multidimensional mathematics, and consciousness theory. The greatest experts in each field have studied it for decades without success. Jake looked up at the holographic display. The equations swirled above him like a mathematical storm. Numbers and symbols danced through multiple dimensions, creating patterns that seemed to shift and change as he watched. The theorem requires proof using only logical deduction, the professor continued. No shortcuts, no guessing, no human intuition. Pure mathematical reasoning is the only path to solution. Jake nodded and took a step closer to the display. The equations seemed to grow larger as he approached, filling his vision with complex formulas and strange symbols. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see how long the human would stare at the impossible problem before admitting defeat. Professor Vextar crossed his 4 arms and waited. In his mind, he was already preparing the speech he would give about the limits of human thinking. This demonstration would show the galaxy that some problems were beyond the reach of primitive species. Jake tilted his head slightly as he studied the theorem. His blue eyes moved across the mathematical structures, following connections that others had missed. The holographic equations continued to shift and turn, but Jake's gaze remained steady and calm. The silence stretched on. Students began to whisper again. How long would the humans stare at the impossible before giving up? The betting pools had predicted he would last no more than 10 minutes. Already 5 minutes had passed. Professor Vextar's smile grew wider. The human was clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of the problem. Soon he would have to admit that some challenges were beyond human capability. Then Jake began to speak. Jake Collins stood in front of the impossible equations for exactly 23 seconds. To the 300 beings watching him, it felt like an hour. The grand auditorium was so quiet that even the hum of the holographic projectors seemed loud. Then Jake spoke, his voice clear and calm. The problem with this theorem is that it's asking the wrong question, he said simply. Professor Vextar's 4 eyes blinked in surprise. What do you mean? Jake pointed up at the swirling mathematics above his head. Everyone has been trying to prove whether consciousness can exist in quantum superposition. But that's not how consciousness works. You're treating it like a thing that can be measured and moved around. But consciousness isn't a thing, it's a process. The crowd began to murmur. Several advanced students leaned forward in their seats, trying to follow Jake's reasoning. Think about it this way, Jake continued. reaching up to touch the holographic equations. When you ask if consciousness can be in superposition, you're asking if the observer can observe itself. But the observer and the thing being observed are the same. It's like asking if your eyes can see themselves seeing. Jake's hands moved through the holographic display, gently pushing aside complex formulas and pulling others forward. The equations that had seemed locked in place began to shift under his touch. The theorem assumes that consciousness is separate from the quantum state it's trying to observe, Jake explained as he worked. But what if consciousness is the quantum state? What if being aware is the same thing as being in superposition? Professor Vextar's silver scales began to pale. That's not possible. Consciousness is a product of brain activity. It's not a fundamental force. Is it? Jake asked, still manipulating the equations. How do you know? Have you ever been conscious of not being conscious? Have you ever experienced the absence of experience? The holographic mathematics began to change under Jake's hands. Where the original theorem had been dense and tangled, Jake's version became clean and simple. Complex formulas collapsed into elegant statements. Multidimensional loops straightened into clear logical paths. If consciousness is the same as quantum superposition, Jake said, then the theorem's question becomes meaningless. It's like asking what color Wednesday is, or how much does music weigh. The question itself doesn't make sense. Dr. Yulmoth stood up in the audience, her large black eyes wide with shock. But the mathematical proofs, the logical structures, they're all valid. Yes, they are, Jake agreed. The math is perfect, but it's solving the wrong problem. It's like using a microscope to look at the moon. The tool works fine, but you're pointing it in the wrong direction. Jake made a final adjustment to the holographic display. The equations that had filled the air with complexity now formed a simple, beautiful pattern. Where hundreds of formulas had twisted together in confusion, now there was just one clear statement. Consciousness creates time, not the other way. Around, Jake said, stepping back from the display. Time doesn't exist without someone to experience it. So asking if consciousness can maintain temporal coherence is like asking if water can stay wet. The question assumes something that isn't true. The reformed theorem hung in the air above the stage, its new form so obviously correct that several students gasped out loud. The mathematical structures that had seemed impossibly complex now looked as natural as the law of gravity. Professor Vextar stared at the display, his forearms hanging limp at his sides. His voice shook when he spoke. How ... How long did it take you to solve this? Jake looked at the clock on the auditorium wall. About 30 seconds of looking at it. Maybe 5 seconds of thinking about it before I started talking. The silence that followed was the deepest quiet in the university's 300-year history. 300 beings from dozens of worlds sat in stunned amazement, their various forms of consciousness struggling to process what they had witnessed. 30 seconds, whispered a Korathi student, whose species had worked on the problem for 50 years. Impossible, said a Vortanian telepath, who had sensed the solution forming in Jake's mind before he spoke. Elegant, admitted a synthetic intelligence whose quantum processors had declared the theorem unsolvable. Chancellor, Colvex floated down from his seat in the upper section. The ancient being's robes shimmered as he approached the stage. Young, human, he said in a voice like distant thunder. Do you understand what you have accomplished? Jake shrugged. I solved a math problem. It wasn't that hard once I figured out what question it was really asking. Not that hard? Professor Zektar's stone body rumbled with laughter. The greatest minds in the galaxy spent 2 centuries on this problem. Maybe that was the problem, Jake said. Sometimes when you work too hard on something, you get stuck in one way of thinking. Like when you lose your keys and keep looking in the same place over and over. Lisa Morgan and Alex Turner pushed through the crowd to reach the stage. Their faces showed amazement and pride. "Jake," Lisa said, "do you realize what this means? You just solved the impossibility theorem." "I guess," Jake replied. "But it's not really impossible, is it? I mean, I just did it." The crowd began to buzz with excitement as the implications sank in. If a human could solve the galaxy's most difficult puzzle in 30 seconds, what else might they be capable of? What other impossible problems might have simple solutions that everyone had missed? Professor Vextar slowly approached Jake, his silver scales now completely pale. "Mr. Collins," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I underestimated your species' abilities." Jake smiled, the expression that had become familiar to his alien classmates. "Don't worry about it, Professor. Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is that we learned something new today." The holographic display continued to show Jake's elegant solution. Its simple beauty, a stark contrast to the complex tangle that had defeated the galaxy's greatest minds. News of the breakthrough was already spreading through the university's communication networks, racing toward every world and known space dot. As the crowd began to disperse, students surrounded Jake with questions. How had he seen the solution so quickly? What made humans think differently than other species? Could he solve other impossible problems? Jake answered as best he could, but the truth was that he didn't fully understand his own thought processes. He had always been good at seeing patterns that others missed, at finding connections that weren't obvious. He had never thought it was anything special. But as he looked around at the amazed faces of beings from across the galaxy, Jake began to realize that maybe being human was more special than he had ever imagined. The age of impossible problems was about to end. The news spread across the galaxy faster than any spaceship could travel. Within hours of Jake's demonstration, every major university had received reports about the human who solved the impossibility theorem in 30 seconds. Within days, the story reached the furthest corners of known space dot at the Centauri University. Life changed overnight. The admissions office was flooded with applications from human students. The waiting list, which had been empty for months, suddenly had over 3,000 names on it. Every human who had ever shown an interest in higher education wanted to study at the school where one of their own had made history. Jake Collins found himself famous throughout the galaxy, but he didn't seem to enjoy the attention. Reporters from dozens of worlds wanted to interview him. Scientists requested brain scans to understand how human thinking worked. Government officials asked if he could solve their most difficult problems. "I just want to go to class and learn," Jake told Lisa Morgan as they walked across campus. "All this attention is making it hard to concentrate." Lisa laughed. "Jake, you're the most famous human in the galaxy right now. You just proved that our species has something special to offer. Enjoy it." But Jake seemed more interested in his regular coursework than in his newfound fame. He attended Professor Vextar's quantum physics class as usual, worked on his assignments, and spent his free time reading detective stories. Professor Vextar himself had become something of a celebrity. As the teacher who had witnessed the breakthrough, he was invited to speak at conferences across the galaxy. But his attitude toward humans had changed completely. "I was wrong about your species," he admitted to Jake after class one day. "I thought intelligence was about processing power and logical thinking. But you have shown me that there are other kinds of intelligence, other ways of understanding the universe." "We all think differently," Jake replied. "That's what makes the galaxy interesting. If everyone thought the same way, we'd never solve the really hard problems." The impact of Jake's solution reached far beyond the university. The Korathi Collective, which had spent 50 years working on the theorem, announced that they were restructuring their entire approach to scientific research. Instead of relying only on computational power, they would now include intuitive Thinking in their methods, the Vortanian High Council, whose telepathic abilities had failed to crack the problem, began recruiting humans as advisors. They wanted to understand how non-telepathic minds could see solutions that eluded mental networks of incredible power. Even the synthetic worlds, home to the galaxy's most advanced artificial intelligences, began studying human thought patterns. They hoped to incorporate human-style intuition into their quantum processors. Dr. Yilmoth from the mathematics department approached Jake with a new problem. "We have 17 other theorems that have been unsolved for decades," she said, showing him a list on her data tablet. "Would you be willing to look at them?" Jake studied the list. The names alone were intimidating. The paradox of infinite recursion, the temporal causality equation, the consciousness multiplication theorem. Each one had defeated the best minds in the galaxy. "I can try," Jake said, "but I can't promise anything. Sometimes the answer just comes to me, and sometimes it doesn't." Over the following weeks, Jake worked his way through the list of impossible problems. He solved the paradox of infinite recursion in 2 minutes by pointing out that infinity wasn't a number but a concept. The temporal causality equation fell to his insight that cause and effect were just different ways of describing the same event. The consciousness multiplication theorem stumped him for almost an hour before he realized it was asking how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. Each solution sent new waves of excitement through the scientific community. Universities across the galaxy began recruiting human students aggressively. Earth's government established exchange programs with dozens of alien worlds. Humanity, which had been seen as a minor newcomer to galactic civilization, suddenly found itself at the center of attention. But Jake remained humble about his achievements. "I'm not solving these problems alone," he told a reporter from the Galactic Science Journal. "Every human thinks differently. Lisa Morgan might see solutions I would miss. Alex Turner might find answers that neither of us could reach. We work better together than apart." This comment led to a new wave of research into collective human problem-solving. Universities began forming mixed teams of humans and aliens to tackle their most difficult challenges. The results were remarkable. Problems that had seemed impossible to single-species research groups fell quickly to human-alien collaboration. Chancellor Kulvex announced that the university would establish the Institute for Intuitive Sciences, with Jake Collins as its first human fellow. The institute would study how different types of intelligence could work together to solve complex problems. "We have learned that logic and intuition are not opposites," the ancient chancellor declared. "They are partners in the search for truth. By combining the analytical power of our greatest minds with the pattern recognition abilities of humans, we can push the boundaries of knowledge further than ever before." Jake accepted the position, but insisted on one condition. He wanted to continue taking regular classes. "I'm still learning," he said. "There's so much about the universe that I don't understand. The only way to get better at solving problems is to keep studying new ones." His human friends were amazed by his attitude. "Jake," Alex Turner said one evening as they sat in the cafeteria, "you could probably get any job in the galaxy right now. You could name your price and work anywhere you want." Jake shrugged and took a bite of his sandwich. "Why would I want to leave? I like it here. The professors are smart, the classes are interesting, and I'm learning something new every day." "But you're famous now," Lisa added. "You're the human who solved the impossible problems." "I'm still just Jake," he replied. "Fame doesn't change who you are inside. It just changes how other people see you." As the semester continued, more humans arrived at the university. Each one brought their own unique way of thinking, their own approach to problem-solving. The campus, which had once been dominated by alien species, began to feel more diverse and vibrant. Professor Vextar watched this transformation with growing excitement. His prejudices about humans had been completely overturned. Now he saw them as the key to unlocking mysteries that had puzzled the galaxy for centuries. "Your species has a gift," he told Jake during their weekly meeting. "You see patterns that others miss. You ask questions that others don't think to ask. You solve problems by changing the rules of the game." "Maybe," Jake said thoughtfully. "Or maybe we just think about things differently, because we're new to all this. We don't know what's supposed to be impossible, so we try anyway." The professor's 4 eyes gleamed with understanding. "Exactly. You have no preconceptions about what can and cannot be done. You approach each problem with fresh eyes." As the academic year drew to a close, Jake reflected on how much had changed since his first day at the university. He had come as an unknown student from a small planet. Now he was recognized as one of the most important minds in the galaxy. But Jake didn't let the fame go to his head. He still ate breakfast in the cafeteria with his friends. He still did his homework every night. He still read detective stories. Before bed, fame was just something that happened around him, not something that changed who he was inside. The other human students had formed a close group. They met every week to discuss their classes and share ideas. Each one had found their own way to contribute to galactic science. Lisa Morgan had discovered 3 new forms of alien life. Alex Turner had designed a faster engine for spaceships. Betty Walsh had created a universal translation system that worked better than anything before it. "We're all doing well because we think differently," Jake observed during one of their meetings. "Humans see the universe in ways that aliens can't, just like aliens see things we miss. The best solutions come when we work together." Professor Vextar had become one of Jake's closest mentors. The alien teacher who had once doubted human intelligence now spent hours learning from his human students. He had written 3 research papers about human problem-solving methods and given speeches at conferences across the galaxy. "You have taught me more than I have taught you," he admitted to Jake one afternoon. "I thought I understood intelligence, but I was only seeing one small part of it. Humans have shown me that there are many ways to be smart." The impossibility theorem, which had once seemed like the ultimate challenge, was now displayed in the university museum. Students from every world came to see the simple solution that had eluded the galaxy's greatest minds for 2 centuries. Next to it hung 17 other impossible problems that Jake and his human colleagues had solved, but Jake was already looking ahead to new challenges. "There are still so many questions we haven't answered," he told his friends. How does consciousness really work? What happened before the universe began? Are there other dimensions we can't see? Those problems might take decades to solve, Alex pointed out. Jake smiled. Then we better get started. The semester ended with a celebration in the grand auditorium. Chancellor Cole Vex presented awards to the year's best students. Jake received the prize for O,